Okay. One of the principles of Jewish ethics is not to punish people who come on time. So we're going to start. And others will filter in, but that is the way of the world. So it's a pleasure to turn it over now to the moderator of this session, who is a dear colleague and friend, Rabbi Ayelet Cohen.
Good afternoon. So we began this day with a conversation between a Jewish, a Muslim, a Catholic, and Protestant thinker who were asked to reflect on what the sacred texts and their traditions are, where they root the concept of divine holiness of every person. And then we have spent the day exploring ways in which that holiness, that dignity, is upheld and is brought low by different forces in our society, and the ways in which we, as humans walking together on this earth, have the opportunity to recognize the innate holiness in one another, in our difference, in the fullness of our identity, and the ways in which devaluing that holiness because elements of our identity are written out of our society, are written out of the protections of our laws, really decreases the holiness in the world. So this session is going to be an opportunity to delve deeply, particularly into the issue of gender and sexuality, and the intersection of holiness and dignity with a diversity of gender and sexual identity, thinking about the challenges that we are facing in very, very real ways in this moment, and lifting up some of the incredible work that is being done. So I'm so thrilled to introduce to you Reverend Dr. Eric Thomas, Assistant Professor of Bible at the General Theological Seminary of the Episcopal Church, and the pastor of Siloam Presbyterian Church in Bedford-Stuyvesant, Brooklyn. His academic work explores queer of color biblical criticism for the ways in which racial, ethnic, queer, trans, and non-binary readers of Scripture find freedom and flourishing in the practice of biblical interpretation. Next, we'll hear from Paisley Currah, Professor of Political Science and Women's and Gender Studies at Brooklyn College and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. His new book project, Legislating Gender, situates the current wave of anti-trans legislation within a longer history of the regulation of gender. And finally, Rabbi Sharon Kleinbaum, who served for 32 years as senior rabbi of Congregation Beit Simchat Torah in New York City, the largest LGBTQ plus synagogue in the world for people of all sexual identities and genders, where she is now senior rabbi Emerita. She's the founder and director of The Beacon. And I now turn it over to Reverend Thomas.
Good afternoon, friends. Good afternoon, friends. I want to begin by thanking the organizers of this conference for the opportunity to speak with and learn from you today. And of course, thanks to all of you for coming out and being a part of this experience with us. As I reflect on our occasion, upholding human dignity in turbulent times, I'm reminded that the history of the gay and lesbian liberation movement, ACT UP, and the queer-led and transgender-informed Black Lives Matter movement has always called for and has already given us examples of dignity in turbulent times. We stand on a path that was paved by Marsha P. Johnson, Sylvia Rivera, and the queer people of color whose names are lost to us in the pinkwashing of LGBT liberation histories. I'm here because of the example set by James Baldwin, Joseph Beam, Essex Hemphill, Audre Lorde, Marlon Riggs, Ibrahim Farajage in their writings, in their standard bearing for queer freedom and dignity for all, and for the legacies that they left for us to continue the work. This week, we call our experience, wisdom, and imagination together in response to the injustice, violence, and religious prejudice, the systemic failure, and the plain old meanness that is happening in our world today. And as we do so, we're encouraged by a great cloud of witnesses who marched and fought and created in order for us to have these conversations today. And so I invite you to pause with me to remember them, particularly those who are not named, those whose names we will never know. My work as an openly Black Presbyterian pastor and as a professor of biblical studies is informed by my own experiences of growing up in a New York City prior to the Disneyfication of Times Square and the Giulianiization of the West Side Highway, affectionately known to many of us as the Piers. I remember what it was like to come into a sense of Black gay agency and dignity in the 1980s and the 1990s. I can imagine the discussions and the debates that seminarians at Union and here at the Jewish Theological Seminary were having back then to articulate and insist upon the presence of God in the midst of the crack and AIDS epidemics. This was an emergent epistemology and activist strategy that did not yet exist in books or in ecclesial affirmations. For those who were not part of those informed discussions, I imagine that nonprofits and activist organizations like Gay Men of African Descent, the Lesbian and Gay Center, the New Jewish Agenda, the Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries, and other groups provided kinship networks where those who were alienated from families and communities of origin were able to become affirmed as they developed families and communities of choice. So I'm suggesting to us that there's a historical resilience to be celebrated in consideration of a present day and a future flourishing dignity that we are constructing in these conversations. And while my memories are located here within the 5 boroughs, we can consider that organizations like these were established all across our country. And therefore, our legacy is not only behind us, we are in it today, and it is yet in front of us. Historians will record and critique how this generation continued the struggle for and embodied the concept of kevod habriot in this generation. That is to say, queer history is both watching us and it is waiting for us. In my own academic and priestly formation, I had to learn for myself that the Creator is not surprised by my sexual orientation, my gender presentation, or my queer inclinations. I echo the words of Reverend Troy Perry from the Metropolitan Community Church movement that the Lord is my shepherd. He knows I'm gay. In my becoming, I had to unlearn the lie that the Christian scriptures only had 6 passages that concerned me. In doing so, I came to realize as a seminarian and newly ordained teaching elder in the Presbyterian Church USA that the Bible is far too often used as a weapon to clobber as opposed to a resource for comfort. And I learned that this practice was and is deeply ingrained into the culture. Plenty of folks we'd call unchurched can recite these verses from Leviticus and from Romans and from 1 Corinthians on demand, I came to understand that not enough of us can claim that we too are fearfully and wonderfully made, that we too are known and called by God even before we were formed in our mother's wombs, and that these religious, social, and cultural prejudices might grant the resilience to grow by faith and experience into the wisdom to say for ourselves that what you meant for evil, God turned around for my good. While we're coming into harmony between our faith formation and our sexual and gender identities, we must also confront the systems and social barriers that challenge queer, trans, and non-binary flourishing. We've seen the impact of the COVID pandemic, for example, on access to healthcare, housing, education, and healthy foods on people who are LGBTQ. Our current presidential administration has made undocumented queer folks, as well as people who can be interpreted as foreign, into potential criminals and hunted by various enforcement agencies. We're learning about the impacts of the government shutdown and the slow reboot on people who are employed by or who depend on federal funding sources. And all of those issues force us to be divided and conquered among racial, ethnic, religious, and political differences. What I hope will come from our conversation today are ideas of how to perform mutual aid intersectionally, not as a performance of charity, but as embodiments of solidarity, so that we can live into the promise of Kevod Habriot in the dynamic and life-affirming ways. And so I look forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Professor Currah.
Well, thank you very much. It's a real pleasure and an honor to be here and to be thinking through these questions about what justice looks like and what human dignity, a little closer, human dignity might look like in this particular political moment. So what I want to focus my remarks on today is the attacks on transgender and non-binary people that we've seen from the Trump administration. And in some states in the last few years. So I'm going to just kind of outline the situation and then talk about ways to push back against it. So on his first day of his presidency this time, President Trump issued an executive order titled Defending Women from Gender Ideology and Restoring Gender Ideology Extremism and Restoring Biological Truth to the Federal Government. And what that order did is it insisted on a certain definition of sex that would apply to everything the federal government does and everything the federal government pays for. And the definition of sex was defined at conception, basically based on the size of the reproductive cells at conception. And if you talk to biologists about this order, they're like, well, that doesn't make sense. You don't know that information at conception, et cetera, et cetera. But in another sense, it kind of doesn't matter because this is Trump using his position, as the president, to declare by fiat what sex is, and then have that definition backed by the force of law. So, this order, as a result of this order, the administration is trying to deny. I mean, a lot of this is being litigated, but is trying to deny trans people in federal prisons the gender-affirming care they need, and is trying to house trans women in men's federal prisons. The administration has banned transgender people from serving in the military, kicking out transgender people and denying them even their retirement benefits after years of service. The administration is going after colleges and universities and schools for the teaching of anything they think is related to gender ideology. The administration is forcing schools and athletic associations to ban trans women and girls from participating in women's sports. So just to kind of aside, the sports associations were already had their own policies about who could play on which team. So the government stepping in is sort of unnecessary, but a lot of these policies now, not just talking about competitive sports, we're talking about like 11-year-olds playing intramural volleyball now have to be governed by this. The administration now requires federal employees. There's a really good Supreme Court decision that says you can't fire someone for being transgender. But the Trump administration has said, okay, we won't fire them, but they have to go, we have to keep track of them according to their birth sex, we'll use the pronouns that are associated with their birth sex, and they have to go to the bathroom associated with their birth sex. But we're not firing them. The administration now is listing birth sex on passports, which will make it very difficult for trans people to travel. Also makes it very difficult for trans people to have an identity document that will verify who they are. The administration is ending transition-related medical care for federal employees and their dependents, which is 8 million people. So this is on top of what's been happening in the states for the last years, where half of them have passed laws banning gender-affirming care for youth, about half have some sort of bathroom law about who can go to what bathroom, lots of them have sports laws. And what I want to talk about, we can talk about sex definition of that stuff if you're interested in, but the order is called Defending Women. And what I want to talk about is that these laws are like described as protecting women. In fact, they do not. So the current wave of efforts to define sex exclusively in biological terms, it puts pressure on non-transgender people, especially non-transgender women, but also men, to conform to a conservative vision of gender difference. So for example, in Texas, the Department of Agriculture has this policy now. It says you have to dress in clothes associated with your birth sex. And they mean that to be kind of mean to transgender people, saying you can't dress in clothes appropriate to how you identify. But it also means it's going to come down heavy on anyone, right? Women have to wear dresses and blouses and women's separates and suits, and men have to wear men's clothing. And there can be no kind of squishiness in between. There was all this email back and forth where people were asking about, what about this kind of clothing, or what about crew socks? Are they masculine or feminine? Like, you try to kind of make fun of the person who had done the order. But it's on a kind of more serious side, this kind of enforcing gender norms is going to harm cisgender women or non-transgender women as well. There's been cases already of cisgender girls who don't appear feminine enough being investigated in sports competitions by parents, saying, oh, she beat my daughter, she must be a trans person, we have to have her investigated. One girl in Utah had like some committee going back all through her medical records to when she was a kindergarten student to investigate her gender. And since the definition of sex that Donald Trump is espousing defines women and men by reproductive capacity, defining women by reproductive capacity is kind of very much aligned with the Trump administration's policy on reproductive rights and reproductive choice. So if you define women by reproductive capacity, forcing women to express that capacity by carrying pregnancies to term is very much a logical consequence of these definitions. So in the pushback, I just want to in the last couple of minutes, end my remarks. We've relied on the courts a lot to advance transgender rights claims, and that's something we can no longer do because the Supreme Court, lower courts are fine, but the Supreme Court has kind of indicated that it's going to probably give a stamp of approval to most of what Trump is doing to transgender people. We saw that last week with when they allowed the passport policy to go forward. So as we think about how to push back, I want to, because the Trump administration is doing all this damage through definitions, and I want to make the case that we shouldn't push back by arguing the definitions. Like, oops, sorry, that was my timer. My 7 minutes are up, but I'll take a couple more minutes. We shouldn't push back by fighting over the definitions. Like, that can happen in policy debates and in court documents and expert witness testimony. But like arguing over the definition of gender, or the definition of sex, or what sex really is, doesn't help us get to the problem. The problem is transgender people are a particularly vulnerable community, because we're a very small percentage of the population, 1.6% at the very most. The majority of Americans don't know a transgender person personally. So instead of like fighting over definitions and promulgating new definitions of sex, we need to do a much better job of telling stories and bringing these definitions down to the level of like the harm these policies are causing on people who are part of their communities, and who are really embedded in their communities and are, just living the life that they need to live for themselves. Because these harms are very much part of the warp and woof of like how we're kind of surviving. One of the things that's happening is some people are saying, oh, he's trying to erase transgender people from public life. In fact, I don't think we should agree to that framing, because trans people are still going to exist. It's just our lives are going to be so much more difficult. But there's still going to be transgender people, but we're going to be tied up at the airport. We're going to be denied entry into bathrooms and countries because we have the wrong identity. But we need to be telling those stories and not kind of spending a lot of time talking about definitions of sex. Because I've been doing a lot of that in my scholarship and my policy work, and that's important work, but it doesn't really convince people. So I'm going to end my remarks there, and I look forward to an interesting conversation with everyone.
Thank you so much, Dr. Currah. And now I invite Rabbi Kleinbaum.
So for me, it's wonderful to be here, and Eric, wonderful to meet you, and Paisley is somebody I've admired and known for many, many years, and his work is really important work in the world, and very grateful for both of you. And to be moderated by Rabbi Ayelet Cohen is just a dream come true for me. So the big picture is this. For many years, we saw this dramatic development of the opening of American society and societies around the world around issues related to LGBTQ and issues around women. Huge opening. And we imagined, all of us, I think in some way, that we were on a trajectory towards it gets better. And it's a shock to find out, in fact, that's not necessarily true. Much is written about that issue itself, and what we're facing in these times of turbulence is that things that we assumed to be true, things that we assumed to be a direction, even if there were a lot of hiccups and burps and it wasn't perfect by any means, the overall trajectory was towards an expansion of rights in this country in general, and towards LGBTQ people and women in general. That assumption we have to completely re-examine and reject. It's no longer true. And in fact, the places of the greatest expansion and openings are the places of the speediest constrictions and oppression, as Paisley really described in great detail. And honestly, he was gentle. I mean, the list is much, much longer, but we see exactly the place where there was opening, there is now tremendous constriction. And as a personal example, the first time I came to JTS, I grew up in a conservative synagogue in New Jersey, and I came when the Great Fire took place in the tower, for those who are conservative movement junkies. What year was that? 65, 66, I came with my Hebrew school because all the books that survived were wet, and we were all, Hebrew schools from all over the New York area came to dry out the books. I have a very strong memory of patting down all the books with newspapers and drying out the books. That's the first time I was at JTS. The second time I was at JTS was in 1975 when I had just turned 16, and my parents sent me to the pastoral psychiatric department. What was that called? The pastoral psychiatry department to make me straight. They sent me here because we were a conservative religious family, conservative Judaism, and my parents were very worried that I was gay, and they thought that JTS could make me straight. Well, JTS was not successful, I have to say, in that endeavor, but that was the second time I was here. And I still have to say, every time I enter the building, I remember the 16-year-old I was coming here to see a psychiatrist employed by JTS who thought they were taking Judaism at its core values to help me become straight. It didn't work so well. Okay, so here I am now. Look at the incredible expansion of the world that I'm teaching here at JTS, young rabbinical students, how to be better rabbis. I'm here speaking to you. So there are so many ways the world has expanded, and yet we're living through this tremendous constriction. So very quickly, Ruth Ben-Ghiat, who's a professor at NYU, and her personal academic specialty is Mussolini and authoritarianism, published a book called Strong Men during Trump 1 period. And in this book called Strong Men, she analyzed all the different strong men in history and in contemporary times, Hitler and Mussolini, Bolsonaro and Trump and Orban and Erdogan, etc., and showed that there were lots of similarities that we could see in both their personalities and the ways in which they instituted authoritarianism in their various cultures. There were a lot of differences, but there was something absolutely the same among all of them. And she calls it hypermasculinity, misogyny, and homophobia, the toxic triad of authoritarian gender politics. Hypermasculinity, misogyny, and homophobia. That's essential as she sees it to all of these strong men in their instituting authoritarianism. Virility and this hypermasculinity is as much a part of what they're trying to do and demonstrate in the world as it is their misogyny and homophobia. And of course, in homophobia, she includes all of the LGBTQ categories. So carry that as a category. And again, maybe we'll discuss it more when we open up the conversation. This is an essential part of authoritarianism, is to do exactly what both of my colleagues have described. And in the case of Hitler, we all, those of us who are Jews, know well the story of the book burnings that took place. The first book burning that you can go to the plaza in Berlin, where there is still a memorial to the first book burning, took place in very soon after Hitler became in May of 1933. What were the books that were the first books to be burned by the Nazi regime? In early May of 1933, he was elected formally in March, so very soon after he became the chancellor as an elected as opposed to appointed position, he went into the Institute for Institute for Sexual Science in Berlin, which was founded in 1919 by a gay Jew named Magnus Hirschfeld. From 1919, it was the first center in the world to study LGBTQ. They called it a little different then. They had they had gender-affirming surgeries as well as support groups. They had a library of 20,000 volumes dedicated to the topic of LGBTQ. Again, the language is a little different, but all these different topics. Those were the first books that the Nazis burned in that plaza in Berlin. On May 6th, they went into the Institute, destroyed the Institute, burned it down, took the 20,000 volumes to that plaza, which somebody here probably remembers the name of the plaza, which Biblioplatz or something like that. Somebody probably remembers the name, I don't remember the name. And 3 days later, all the Nazi youth had huge bonfires to burn those 20,000 volumes. Who was Magnus Hirschfeld? He was a gay Jew. He was very closeted as a gay man, but he was a physician, and he came from a German Jewish family. In 1892, he became a doctor, and he was the leading researcher of issues around sex and gender identity, sexuality, and he co-founded in 1897 Scientific Humanitarian Committee, which advocated for the decriminalization of sexual relations between men, 1897. In 1909, he fought against a proposal to criminalize sexual relations between women, and he started a very famous campaign to revise paragraph 175 in German law code, which criminalized same-sex relations. You should know that paragraph 175, which was used by the Nazis to send Austrian and German gay men to concentration camps and Austrian and German lesbians to brothels, essentially, where they were raped by German soldiers in order to produce German children, because they believed as long as a woman had a uterus, let's not kill them, let's make sure they produce good Aryan children. That paragraph 175 stayed in place until 1992. So after the war, gay people who were in concentration camps were then put in German prisons. And this became part of the legacy of what we know as what the Germans did in the Holocaust. Lesbians were not generally put into concentration camps. It was primarily German men. And by the way, not gay people who were Polish or Slavic or any non-Aryans, because those were going to be, if they were not Jewish, they were going to be slaves in the Third Reich anyway. They didn't really care about gay people who were not German. So this man, can you imagine this early time advocating against paragraph 175? And Hitler identified him as an example of a Jew who was destroying Aryan society itself in the 1920s. We have lots of examples of Hitler identifying Magnus Hirschfeld as the example of what was wrong with Jews, because he was advocating for the liberalization of laws around gay people. Very similar, by the way, from the attack for that Christian white supremacist who attacked the synagogue in Pittsburgh, largely because, and in his own writing said, because these Jews are letting immigrants in. Jews care about immigrants, so I'm going to kill the Jews. So Nazi propaganda used him very much that way. So what have we learned? The integral nature of what LGBTQ, non-binary, trans folks present to authoritarianism, as well as women's rights itself, because as Paisley described, they're integrated. The issue about the understanding of, because if you're focused on hypermasculinity, anything that threatens hypermasculinity becomes a danger to authoritarians. So, what have we learned? Silence equals death, that we understand the power of silence by everybody when we see these things happen. Bimkom she'eno anashim, in a place where there is no humanity, the Mishnah teaches us that's exactly the moment that we have to be deeply human. And that becomes our challenge today, and I look forward to discussing these things together. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all of you. You've given us so much to think about. And I wanted to start by a through line I heard in what all of you said, which is the tension between being reduced to definitions, and specifically somebody else's definitions, and the importance of lifting up the stories of people's lives, the names of the people on whose shoulders we stand, to make sure that they are not forgotten, that their work is not forgotten, and that we keep doing that work. And so how do we do that when we live in a world which is operating under somebody else's rules and somebody else's definitions?
Well, I'll start in by telling a story of, there's the first state to pass a ban on trans-affirming care was, I think it was Alabama, but it might have been Arkansas. Sorry, Arkansas and Alabama. Anyways, a colleague of mine was
such a New Yorker.
I know. A colleague of mine, brought a case to the court to challenge the constitutionality of the ban, and this was the person was from some small community, and I think it was Alabama, And with her, when she came to court, she was surrounded by her family, her pastor. Her pastor was even named in the lawsuit. And the people who were her parents, they did not like transgender people at all. They just didn't. And then they had this kid who was transgender, and they are her parents. And so they're fiercely protective of her, and they brought the suit. And it really made an effect on the judge. They won. they won. What happens, however, is that as you go up the court, it becomes more abstracted and more divorced from reality, and often the plaintiffs aren't even in the room, and then it just becomes about talking points and right-wing foundations and expert witnesses who don't know what they're talking about. But at the level of storytelling, that's what we need to be doing more at the local level in a face-to-face way.
During this last election, one of the most effective ads that the Republicans used, which was played apparently at every sports game, every football game, all throughout all of the various TV, huge episodes, was a very simple ad. It said, Kamala Harris is for them, Donald Trump is for you. And the them meaning trans and non-binary people. And that ad, all of the scholars who have been studying this say was really effective. Why? Because our side never responded to it because they thought that they could just ignore it and it would go away. We have to do exactly what Paisley is talking about, the stories of real folks who are the thems. Like that, we shouldn't be afraid of that. We should be able to say, we should have flooded the airways with stories of regular people who are trans and non-binary telling their stories. I think that's the reason that the gay movement was so successful so quickly. You know, we look at it, it was basically a period of let's say from 1969 to, basically a period of 40 years, really, that the transformation took place. It took place because gay people told their stories to lots of people so that they could no longer say it was an abstraction, and they're talking about exactly what Paisley said, arguing, is homosexuality, does God like homosexual, But if you have a human being in front of you, and I did a lot of this, I did the lesbian rabbi dog and pony show so much. I went into so many synagogues and listened to people's fears and had them tell me what they were worried about. It was okay if their hairdresser was gay, but they didn't want their Hebrew school teacher to be gay, and just have them say it out loud and I respected them and understood their fear. But a lot of us did that, and a lot of us were the children or the mothers or the uncles or the cousins of somebody who had to confront a real human being and get it away a little bit from just the theory. And we need to do that. And we need to pour money into that. And we need to take that on as a country and say, okay, you want to talk about the theory? All right, but listen, here's a human being sitting in front of you. Listen to this story. And so I really agree, the stories are really important. And I think the Democrats really blew it on that. We all know now understand that ad had a huge impact. And instead of saying, well, who are the thems? Who are the people that say they? And really make it human. And not do it in a condescending way, by the way. I think people's fears are fair. And I think people's questions about sports are real. Let's have a real adult conversation about what the real fears are. And there are real answers to them. And we can't say, and the woke stuff, they also use against us. And we have to be respectful and say, and not all of us can do it, right? Some people can sit with people who are in the process of working that out, and some of us can't. I, have an appetite for it up to a certain amount, and then I don't. But that's okay, but we have to find a way to engage respectfully and say, I understand the fears, let's talk about them, let's think them through, let's parse it out, and move ahead.
To what we've just heard, I would just say we have to break the rules, right? We have to be able to reframe the lives, the issues, the beliefs that we represent, so that we're not limited by other people's definitions of what the scriptures say, or what holiness is, or what a story of humanity is.
Yep.
But we are able to do that in all the different ways that we enter into connection with each other.
I'd like to talk about fear a little bit. It's such a strong element in this conversation. Why is the fear so powerful? Why is the attempt or the reality of breaking down other people's ideas of what gender looks like, of what gender identity looks like, it's visceral. In my experience as a religious Jew, laws written and created by men legislating women have not worked out that well for us. And a lot of that is about a fear of what we don't understand. And certainly in classical Judaism, the mystery around menstruation and reproduction leads to so much separation and diminishing of power of women. And the fear is very present. And so I'd like to ask the three of you to talk about that. Why does the fear continue to take hold? What's it about? Why is it so strong?
I have a hypothesis that people whose identities are constructed by power and knowledge and heteronormativity and so forth, when they realize another person's humanity, it means that they've got to undo themselves. People don't want to undo the power that they have to be the person that says Adam and Eve and not Adam and Steve, or the power that one has that says we don't want those people over here. They have to undo themselves. So, for example, what would white people be without racism? Consider for a moment. What would heterosexual people be without that kind of prejudice against the LGBT community, et cetera? So some of that fear is that we actually have to let go of the power to make someone less than.
Yeah, and I'll just jump in. I think this is a really good question, and it kind of gets to a point that Sharon made. And this is especially true in the United Kingdom for some reason, but it's also a little true here. There's all this discourse about people going into bathrooms to sexually assault women, and the idea is that trans women are going to a bathroom and are going to sexually assault women. And we have lots of social science saying that doesn't happen, but the people who are most assaulted in bathrooms are cisgender women who don't look feminine enough in women's bathrooms. They are harassed, assaulted, yelled at. Men's bathrooms, no one seems to care. Nothing really happens in there. But women's bathrooms are a site of panic and fear. But we can't take that fear and say, it's like I have a kid and I've learned you don't argue with emotions. They say they don't exist. But you have to say, let's think about where that fear comes from, because sexual assault is real and it's not being dealt with. And so you are being manipulated into channeling all your really well-founded fears onto the figure of the transgender woman rapist. And we have to kind of really talk to people at that level instead of just kind of saying, I can give you some social science to say that doesn't happen.
Yeah, I think it comes down to this issue, exactly what you both said, which is we have to acknowledge what the fear is and then help people unpack it a little bit. And we don't know everything, but we understand exactly what you said. Sexual assault is real. Nobody wants to go into a bathroom and be afraid that there's a female-presenting male assaulter who's there in a dress, but pretending he's a she just so he could assault a woman in a bathroom. All right, that would be bad. That would be pretty bad. So, maybe the answer is private bathrooms. Maybe there are solutions that can help structurally deal with it, and which is, by the way, you go into most restaurants in New York, the bathrooms are individual bathrooms that you get to choose which one you go into. So what if everywhere there was a group bathroom, so to speak, there'd also be an individual bathroom? So if you did feel that fear, if that was real for you, you could go into an individual bathroom, close and lock the door, and do your business. Do you know what I mean? We have to say, okay, let's really try and dig down to what the fear is, but sexual assault is real. And this happened a lot in the gay movement too, because there was a lot of issue about gay men were seen as pedophiles. And one of the things that we did over and over again is to get this FBI statistics about who assaulted children in America. 99% are straight, cisgendered men. Okay? Where is the movement to do some controlling of straight men who are mostly the pedophiles in America? And we kept bringing that statistic out because and pedophilia is a real issue in America. How do we do something about that? But somehow the appetite for doing something about who is actually the perpetrator, but trying to get people to say, and some of it is really very one-on-one, very making sure that information is available, and really looking at the fear. But it's really important to take the fear seriously. But my favorite thing was saying to people, did you know that studies show that people who are really, really deeply afraid of gay people are usually afraid that they are gay themselves? That really helped the conversation change. And it turns out there's a certain amount of the people who are really react that way are worried about themselves. So how do we create an environment in which that can be dealt with? Right? I mean, that's the question. How do we respect it enough so that people can unpack it and find a way through it? And of course, that's my agenda, to get through it. But I also respect people because we're all, as you described, we're all victims of the cultural upbringings we've had, the religious upbringings, the societal upbringings, and we all have work to do to become who God wants us to be. So when we recognize that we're all on this journey, I have things to unpack. I'm a white girl from New Jersey. I have to do a lot of work. It's really important not to be condescending and say, you're the only one who's somehow the unevolved human being and I'm the perfect. We're not. We're all in this together, and maybe each of us has a little piece of wisdom to help move us along. But we do live in a society that likes to point fingers, and that is really not a successful strategy for helping people change.
So Eric, you said queer history is watching us and waiting for us. I'm thinking about, Sharon, how you talked about how the last 40, 50 years were such a time of dramatic change. Yep. And specifically, if we think about the evolution of religion in this country and the role of women and LGBT folks in religious leadership in this country, it's astounding to think about how much has shifted over the last 40 and 50 years. I was just last week at a retreat of celebrating the 40th anniversary of women's ordination in the conservative movement, 75 women rabbis, and talking about the things that have changed and the things where it feels like we're moving backwards. One of the issues that came up a lot was around religious garb. And I was thinking, Paisley, about what you were talking about in terms of the legislation in Texas. In Judaism, so much religious garb is traditionally gendered. And we've done so much work over the last decades to shift that understanding that talit and tefillin, prayer shawls and phylacteries don't have to be seen as gendered garments, even though in almost every popular media representation, we still only see those ritual objects associated with cisgender men. There's a famous photo from the early 90s by the photographer Frederick Brenner of women here wearing tefillin and talit of different ages, some undergraduates, some graduate and rabbinical students, some faculty. And they look very serious and very joyless and very angry. And one of the people, Rabbi Jill Jacobs, who was teaching earlier, is in that photo as an undergraduate. And she was saying that another woman in the photo always hated the picture because they look so angry. And they look like they're not having any fun. And that eventually she started to like that they looked very tough in the photo because there's a lot to be angry about. And yet, we're still often working off of other people's definitions. Yeah. So, especially for the two of you, I'd like you to talk about how women and queer leadership in religious institutions has shifted the conversation in this country, and what's the next step of the work that we need to do?
You go first.
this saying of Paul, we have to equip the saints, right? And that the saints are not all cisgender men, right? We also have to be really, really careful not to replicate the same kind of misogynistic, patriarchal things that we came from. So I have experienced affirming churches where, you know, the trans community are kind of like treated as folding chairs. We bring them out when it's time to write a grant and Trans Day of Remembrance, and then we put them back. Where, you know, a lot of that same kind of, it's just gay and lesbian people performing patriarchy. So we don't want to do that. We don't want to replicate those same kinds of systems. That being said, the fact that there are bishops who are women, that there are pastors who are women, that there are pastors who are trans people, right? And authors of books and leaders of movements makes a big, big difference in these days and times, in comparison to a time where that was not even imagined. Right, we didn't have the books and the liturgies back in the 70s and the 80s that we do now, right? Renaming liturgies and so forth. So I would say that is a direction that we're going to continue to follow in.
Thank you.
Well, I think religion has a lot of problems right now, and this is just one of them. So, oy gewalt is all I can say. So I think so I agree with everything you've said, so I'll try and say something else, or in addition. Part of it is a theological question also. It changes the way we think about God, and that's really important. And certainly women's participation began that process. If all of a sudden women are in religious leadership, we stop or challenge the question, are we thinking about God only male? If it's and that brings a lot of, for Jews, which is the theology I know the best, of course, that raises lots and lots of questions for Judaism that are way bigger than just participation. What does it mean when we start reimagining and thinking about God in really different ways? And that story is far from over. And I hope it's more than just participation of all of our different groups, but rather a real engagement on the constant theological question of who is and what is the Holy One, and how do we pray, how do we live, how do we study sacred texts. All of that becomes a big question.
Thanks. So in a couple of minutes, we're going to open it up to questions from the floor, so you can start formulating your questions. But before we get to that, we talked about fear. Let's talk about joy.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
What is the role of joy in the work that each of you do?
Well, I'm going to start to say that I think this is one of the great gifts that the queer world has to offer. The queer world has suffered and continues to suffer in all parts of the world, and including here in the United States. And within the queer culture, there's such a tremendous amount of joy. I mean, that's a part of what it is. That is a deep part of who we are. And I think it's true also, it has been true historically for Jews in years of oppression, that humor and joy has been a part of Jewish life, less so in America, where the oppression has not been so bad. That's something that's a very interesting piece to it. But I'll just say very quickly that when I first came to CBST, it was right in the midst of the AIDS epidemic in 1992, and 40% of our synagogue died from AIDS. So there was constant death, constant suffering, but let me just tell you something, that community knew how to have a good time. You know, it was not defined only by the death and the sadness, and that was true, that was really deeply true. And one of the stories that I tell all the time is that on Shabbat, on Friday nights, yes, we would talk about who died that week, or who was sick that week, or who was in mourning that week, but we would make sure that Shabbat always still had Shabbat, the pleasure, the Shabbat oneg, the joy of Shabbat. And gay culture created such great theater and culture and arts and celebration in the midst of the pain. And that ability to hold both at the same time is a particularly, I think, queer teaching that we have to offer the world. I don't know if you guys agree.
Oh, for sure, for sure. Well, I'll tell a little story, but last March I was invited to give a talk in California. It was like a transgender talk, and it was such a terrible time, and I thought, this is gonna be not fun, and then, obviously it wasn't gonna be fun, but then I was invited to hang out with the LGBT student group after for a couple hours. I thought, what am I gonna say to these young people? It's gonna be so depressing. And then we hung out, and they were making posters, they had board games, they were creating community face-to-face, they were talking about how to sneak into a concert that they wanted to go to without paying, like, they were just scheming and having fun, and I was just like so joyful to see, like, because I just read policy all day and then I write about it and I'm by myself and it's really depressing, and then just to see these people in community, and they really did, and the person who shepherded the group really insisted that like they meet face to face once a week for a couple hours, and they're not just online by themselves staring into their phone, and it was just remarkable to see the resilience of these young people who I didn't know what to say, but they made me feel better. So.
And I'll just pick up that sentence. Joy is part of the resilience.
Yeah.
Joy is part of the resistance. It says that death does not have the last word. It says that rejection does not have the last word. It says that these troubles of the world are able to be overcome with community. And this is why the dance club is so important.
Exactly.
This is why drag shows are so important. This is why the various collectives where people come together and laugh and tell stories helps the community make it through these turbulent times.
I say to young people all the time, I was out in the 70s when there was not a single civil right that a lesbian had in this country. Not a single one. There was not a single rabbi in America in the 70s who said anything except that gay people were destined for, hell in the way that Jews say it. And we had a great time. I mean, there was a great subculture that existed. And we felt sorry for straight people. We thought they were sad and boring, and we were the ones that were having parties and really fun and were full of life. So I keep saying, we're going to lose gay marriage in this country. That's probably going to happen within the next couple of years for sure. We had a lot of fun before there was gay marriage, It's like, and I just think the idea that our souls, our internal, our cultural happiness is based on these things we have to get away from. Obviously, we're going to fight for rights. We're going to fight really hard. We're not going to accept it, and I think this is what Jews knew in Europe, by the way, and not so much in America, that you can have a really rich and generative and culturally expansive community without political rights. And that's something that has to sustain us as well. And then we fight for them.
So let's hear some of your questions. Tamara, do you have a microphone, or are we doing projecting? Why don't you try? Let's see.
So I have so many little notes. So it's kind of a comment, kind of a think with me, please kind of thing. Maybe it's clear from earlier today that a lot of my work is in gender and sexuality and in strategy in the community. So the question comes out of there. Thank you so much. Before I ask the question, though, I did just want to return back to what Reverend Dr. Thomas said. I really heard, and when I say heard, the hearing in this part of the body, this comment about, it took me a long time to learn that not only those verses, those weren't the only verses or excerpts about me. That's a real profound kind of exegetical statement. And it brings me really to the question I want to ask about strategy, because, right, so much of us spend so much time exegeting, re-exegeting, imagining, telling stories to dig ourselves out of the hole that someone else has made for us, when in fact, who said that the rest wasn't about us? And so there's some kind of strategic refusal, and I was just in Rabbi Jacob's session on kind of strategies, and one of them is refusal, right, non-participation. And so just coming out of that non-participation, and I'll contextualize myself in a different way for a second, coming out of that idea of non-refusal as someone who is very familiar with kind of the obsessive focus on gendered every kind of other type exclusion, but also as a Muslim person in the United States. We have expended an extraordinary amount of labor to render ourselves legible and worthy of other people's care. And we did that for decades on the basis of telling our stories and the idea that enough stories would eventually create a hill that we could stand on and not be in our hole anymore. And I think one thing that I would say that many Muslim Americans feel in the current moment is, was that work worth it? Because we're back to a place where those stories are not necessarily legible. And I guess I can't, out of my work, think that all of our stories are hearable in the same way. They are incredibly, what are white people without racism? I mean, stories are racialized, right? Whose stories matter are racialized, and the stories about, who is offended or hurt, it's not because they're hurt or human, it's also because who they are racially in power and religiously. And so I'm just really asking the question because it's something I struggle with, and I trust all of your expertise and other people's in the rooms. I know stories are important, right? They are transformative. I'm asking what's your thinking on the balance, because a lot of community effort and labor is expended to trying to make other people see your humanity, and it doesn't always pay off, right? Okay, so.
Well, that's a hard one. I'll just say one thing. That's a very, important comment, and I think it gives me pause in terms of storytelling. But one of the larger, when you talk about making communities trying to make themselves legible, I think that's certainly what the LGBT rights community has done. And in some way, part of the legibility was like, we're just like you, so give us marriage rights. And I think, I'm not against that as a strategy, but I think we weren't considering enough and I'm a political scientist, so once in a while I slip into talking with the state, but what kind of state do we want to be legible to, right? And so we weren't thinking kind of always deep enough about, if we go to prison, we want to be housed in the right unit, instead of thinking about what is prison for and why are so many people in prison. So I think sometimes in the queer movement, the legibility didn't go deep enough into who we were making ourselves legible to. So it's a really important comment.
I think there are two kinds of politics. One is transactional and one is transformational. And we kind of have to do both at the same time. Transactional means we kind of look at that's a good example about the prison. Transactional means, all right, there's a situation for a trans person going to a prison. We need to make that better. Transformational is looking at the big picture and transforming the very system of incarceration in this country. You have to do both at the same time. You have to do both. You can't, and it's not enough to do one without the other. Unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, and change happens in both the transactional and transformational sense. And one has a lot of vision about what's possible, but we also have to make sure that things that we can improve that are maybe smaller than we want them to be, we can do that as well. But I think the Muslim community in America is a good example of there are tremendous strides and there are back. It's like this is also, we want things to be only in one direction. And we are learning that is really not true. And there have been tremendous, I have the wrong glasses on. So that's complicated, right? Because you feel the ways that things haven't gotten better. And yet, look at the number of Muslim Americans who were elected to office, including in this city, but around the country. It would have been inconceivable 20 years ago. It's not enough in the sense of the transformation of the way we look at things. But that's what's complicated for the LGBT world, too. There's the transactional changes, which are really sometimes very good, while the transformational still needs a lot of work. And leadership is about holding both at the same time and not being undermined, not losing our sight on the transformational, while we also we kind of have to do that thing. especially you policy people.
I think Rabbi Sharon brings up an interesting kind of hermeneutics. So as we're answering your question, is the solution transactional or is it transformational? Because one of the ways to answer the question is that our stories matter to us, right? So who is the object of mattering, right? In terms of you ask a very complicated, in its depth and in its breadth kind of question. And so one of the ways is, that to reaffirm that our stories matter to us, right? And I can tell you as a Bible scholar, the footnotes are pages long about what other people have said to debunk all of the clobber passages, and people still insist on limiting themselves to that. They disunderstand. They don't misunderstand. They make a decision not to understand. And so for my work, I have to decide I'm not talking to you. How about that? How about I'm not talking to you? How about I don't need to be a part of this congregation? Right? The time for knocking on the door and saying, we were baptized too, and homophobia hurts our feelings, so stop. Is kind of a period that we can look at in the 20th century. But in the 21st century, with the internet and other options and choices, we have other options and choices, my friend. And let us cultivate options and choices for our freedom and for our flourishing. Some of us are called to the work of trying to change people's minds. And I affirm them like they're important people. It's not me. Speaking for myself, it's not me. But some people are called to that work. So it's both transformational and it's transactional. And we've got to do this or we'll be where we were. And we're not going to do that.
Do we have time for one more question?
There's a hand over there.
Yeah.
Hi. Ooh, thank you all so much. I'm wondering in this kind of struggle between like resilience and resistance. So in my congregation, I really wanted us to be part of the Pride celebration in Harrisburg in a big way. We're in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, but it happens on Shabbat. So I was like, okay, let's do something big on Sunday. So our group of LGBTQ folks at the synagogue got together and said, ooh, it would be really fun to do a drag brunch. It could be like the after party for Pride. And we're really excited about that as a reconciliation, also because sort of part of what we haven't totally brought up here is that there's been some rupture, at least in my experience in Harrisburg, between the Jewish and the queer community over Israel-Palestine issues. But, kind of like that aside, I was hoping to kind of create some reconciliation moment. And when I brought that to my synagogue, the pushback was, look, we're really here for Pride Shabbat. We love what you do with the melodies and the centering our LGBT members, but this is too much. We can't have a drag show in the synagogue. Why don't you do it somewhere else, but just not in the synagogue? And so ultimately, I felt like I needed to sort of push and just have it go through. And we our concession was we called it a Pride celebration instead of a drag brunch, and that seemed to help some people swallow it. But I felt like, I guess what my question is where do you sort of push through, and where do you hear people's fears? What's the difference between sort of hearing people's fears and taking care of them, and holding a line around dignity or whatever else? Yeah, I don't know if that was clear.
Thank you. And I think that's actually a great place for everyone to give a final statement about resilience and resistance. And how do we balance? How do we push through? How do we transform? Should we start here again and then move down the line?
My best attempt is that the Spirit tells us when to do what.
Yeah.
Right? This is very contextual for all of us.
I agree.
right? And I think that there is a divine knowledge about like when to push and also when to give grace and patience. And sometimes it doesn't have to be at that place, it could be at another place, but we can do both. We can walk and chew gum, we can be resilient and resistant at the same time, fabulously.
Yeah.
I would just second that in terms of meeting people where they are and try to not make people move it more quickly than they can move, but also create the conditions for so that they can move eventually. So I don't have anything more to add, but thank you, Eric.
Part of what you're asking is really an organizing question. How do you transform, change? How do you introduce new things? And that's an organizing thing. It's not just philosophical. And sometimes you do need to pull back. If it's a new idea, sometimes it's better to introduce it and say, let's study it for a year. And I can give you lots of examples of where people feel, you don't have to feel the speed to do things sometimes. Sometimes you do, but most times, it's really okay to introduce things. And I'll give you just my one example of that, and then I'll close, which is I was part of the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College when it was not okay to be gay, which is really hard to understand. I didn't come to JTS because when I was coming to rabbinical school, JTS was not yet accepting women. HUC was not accepting gay people. So the only school I could go to as an openly gay woman was to go to RRC, but it wasn't really ready for that. And the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College Association introduced several years into my time at the RRC, a resolution supporting marriage for rabbis to perform for a same-sex couple. It was explosively divisive. I realized we could have passed if we voted. We would have had a small majority, so it could have won. But what I did as one of the few openly gay people, I said, you know what, let's not vote on it right now, because I don't want it to pass by 51%. So I said, let's not do it this year. Let's spend the year studying. Let's create a study packet for all rabbis to do in regions around the country and come back to it next year. And the next year it passed like 90%. So sometimes you just have to, it's like what you're saying, sometimes you have to feel when it's right to push, and it's often the best thing to do is to respect people and say, you know what, maybe we need a little more time. Now, nobody would believe that about RRC, right? Anyway, so the last thing I'd say is what really animates so much of my life, which is that joy itself is an act of spiritual and political resistance. Feeling happy, doing things that bring you pleasure, it's an act of resistance and resilience. It doesn't have to be big in public, but making sure we are not crushed by the incredible burden of history happening right now in such a painful way is an act of resistance and resilience.
Thank you. Thanks to all of you.
You guys are great. This is really fun.
We're grateful for your leadership, for your resistance, for your resilience, and the ways in which you teach us how to fight with joy. So thank you. So next.